This afternoon we will be speaking with Maria Khan. Maria Khan is the Secretary General of the Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education. Ms. Khan has been with the organization since 1995. She has a degree in Business Administration from the University of the Philippines and a master's degree in Rural Development from the University of East Anglia. Ms. Khan features in the International Adult and Continuing Education Hall of Fame. She is an accomplished advocate for the cause of education. It's a pleasure meeting you in person, Ms. Khan.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to be with you this afternoon and for the opportunity to introduce my organization and the work that we do in ASPE.
Ms. Khan, would you share with our students about the history and the purpose of ASPE?
Well, perhaps as the name implies, we are a regional Asia-Pacific membership-based civil society network. We've been around for quite a while. We were established in 1964 in Sydney, Australia. And our organization has reshaped itself to adjust to the different circumstances, obtaining remain relevant as a civil society network and as a champion for basic and adult education. In our current incarnation, we have a membership base of more than 130 member organizations and more than 100 individual members operating in more than 30 countries all over the Asia-Pacific region. And our membership is bound by a common commitment to promote the right of all to quality basic and adult education. We believe that government, states, are the duty bearers in ensuring that quality education is available for all children, youth, and adults throughout their lives and at different stages of their lives. We believe in an education that is dedicated towards the full development of a human being so that they are able to participate well in society, contribute well to society, and transform the conditions of their communities and of the world as well in ensuring peace, in ensuring equitable, sustainable development for all. Our member organizations also believe that civil society has a very strong role to play in holding governments to account to fulfill the right of their citizens to adult education and basic education. And we also believe that civil society organizations are important stakeholders in education, especially in the field of adult non-formal education. We are very strong providers of adult education, especially with our observed steep decline in state provisioning for adult non-formal education over the last couple of decades. It's NGOs and the community education and adult education provisioning that they offer that in many instances has been the only recourse of many of vulnerable, poor, and marginalized communities to learning opportunities to help them survive, cope, and change their conditions. So in that sense, we think civil society organizations are very important players in the field of adult education, so they have a stake in policies which define adult education and education direction and priority.
Actually, I was very interested in the part about the membership. I mean, you emphasize the membership base so much. So what difference do you think a membership base, I mean, the fact that it is a membership based organization, what difference does it make, you think, as compared with other kinds of organizations?
I think one is in terms of our governance structure, right? We have to be organized or structured in a way so that the different perspectives of our members very directly inform the way our organization operates, its priorities. So in a sense, we have to be organized so that we are able to reach out to and listen to a wider or a broader variety of views and perspectives, and in the diversity of contexts of the Asia Pacific, in our case, as a regional organization. I think as well, it offers us a very strong advantage in terms of being able to draw on expertise and volunteer time of a lot of our members, of our member organizations. Technical expertise, which in more traditional organizations perhaps you would tend to perhaps buy, or you'd have to resource in different ways. But in a membership-based organization, by definition, right, you can rely heavily on contributions of your members in making the organization work.
I would imagine that that itself is actually speaks for the organization. I mean, the fact that it's membership based, because if we are thinking of, I mean, you spoke about values and all that, and if we are talking about democratic values and all, the organization that is actually working towards that would need to have a democratic structure as well, and that I think is what ASBE has.
Absolutely. And you have to be particularly sensitive to this if you want to sustain yourself as a membership-based network. You should operate in a way that members feel a strong sense of ownership with the organization, because that's the only way the organization can survive and thrive.
And I suppose in today's day and age, the fact of valuing diversity and believing that it kind of adds to the the completeness of the wholeness.
Yes.
Yeah, I think would be important, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you tell us about what are the kinds of activities that ASBE carries out? I mean, what do the member organizations do exactly on the ground, and what does ASBE do to support them? Yeah.
Well, following from your earlier question, I think the type of activities that we do is to a large extent coming from or ordained by the nature of our organization as a regional and membership-based organization. So what we have attempted to do through the years is craft our work so that we add value to the work of our members, and likewise to contribute as a regional organization to our common goals and objectives towards promoting the right to education and basic and adult education. No? So across the years, our work has generally been organized around 4 main strategies. One is on capacity building, leadership and capacity building. A second is on policy advocacy. A third is around strategic partnerships or building strategic partnerships. And the fourth would be around institutional strengthening. Our work around leadership and capacity building is oriented into 2 streams. To a large extent, speaking to the needs of the 2 general types of membership that we have in ASBE. On the one hand, we have those who are solidly in the practice of adult education, who run adult education and education programs. And more over the last 2 decades, as our organization placed a lot more emphasis in adult education and basic and adult education advocacy, in advocacy and lobbying work. So our capacity building efforts have been oriented into building capacities in these 2 streams, in adult education practice and in policy advocacy. So in our capacity building work for promoting adult education practice, we provide opportunities by which our members learn from each other. There is such a rich and dynamic tradition adult education in the region, especially attending to the needs of marginalized communities. So it's been a very useful space that a regional organization such as ASBE is able to provide, so that the rich experiences of our members can be shared, and in that sense they learn from each other, they pick up from how organizations do things differently in different contexts, and therefore use that to translate into new ways of doing things in their own work, and better their own work. It's also assisted in terms of building a layer of leaders in the field of education and adult education who are able to operate at cross-country levels. So most of the opportunities for leadership building among civil society organizations are at the national level. And there are rare opportunities to build capacities for them to operate cross-country or regionally, or in sub-regions as well. So we have also provided opportunities for that, and thereby strengthening civil society and the infrastructure for civil society and education in the Asia-Pacific region. In terms, so these are some of the things we do in terms of capacity building for adult education practice, and they take expression in workshops, conferences, training of trainers, documentation of good practice, researches, studies, etc. In terms of capacity building for advocacy, we lend technical support to groups who are attempting to do policy advocacy, especially at the national and even subnational levels. They take expressions such as trainings around budget tracking, support in terms of policy research being undertaken by groups, and also in terms of institutional strengthening, because you need a different type of civil society formation to be able to gain credibility and have a powerful voice in ways where you can attempt to shape policy. And mostly these are formations that are broad-based. They bring together a wide variety of groups with different perspectives to come together under a common platform and speak in a common voice to shape policy. So the capacities to strengthen those types of organizations are things that have to be built. They don't just happen by accident, and we foster capacity building activities which promote this. We also do policy advocacy ourselves, and because we are a regional organization, most of our advocacy efforts are oriented to regional policy spaces on education and in global spaces as well. Obviously, to have what we have realized is to be able to operate effectively, for you to have credibility in these regional and global spaces, you should be able to demonstrate that you are grounded and linked at the national level, that you represent a voice which does not only come from you in your person, but it actually is based on and gives voice to a wider constituency who you are accountable to. So it's within this, if you like, approach, understanding, ethos that we've taken on representative roles for civil society in, say, UNESCO technical committees through the last 15 years around the Education for All follow-up processes. And we've also played very active roles in the processes which define the new education agenda globally, which is very much linked to what is now known as the Sustainable Development Goals. I think, as you would be familiar with, there is now a goal within the Sustainable Development Goals dedicated to education. And there was a fairly broad-based and extensive set of consultations which were launched to shape this. And we in ASPE actually played a very strong role representing civil society in these processes. Now, we believe we can't do all of this alone, and especially if one attempts to operate and influence policy discourses at the global level, you will have to align yourselves with like-minded civil society networks, other counterparts in other regions, other civil society networks in other regions. And so that's why we've also put an emphasis on building strategic partnerships into our work. So we've aligned with several global formations on education, notably the International Council for Adult Education and the Global Campaign for Education. Now, these are two major education networks who have been very active in advocacy work. And obviously, to do all of this, you have to be institutionally robust. You have to remain credible to your constituents. You have to maintain strong governance structures so that your membership continues to believe in you and you continue to be effective. And so institutional strengthening is certainly part of what.
Now, I mean, you spoke about, the international policy advocacy that you do, I think, has come through fairly clearly, the regional and the global advocacy. Yeah. But I would be interested in knowing the kind of you spoke about national and subnational campaigns as well.
Yeah.
And your capacity building of organizations towards them.
Yeah.
Now, in would you be able to share an example perhaps of policy advocacy that has been facilitated or supported by ASBE in that area?
Yeah.
In terms of capacity building at national level perhaps or subnational level. Yeah.
There's several. First of all, we operate, I think as I mentioned earlier, for our advocacy work through what we call National Education Campaign Coalitions, because these are the broad-based formations that undertake advocacy work. Take an example in the South Pacific. We work there with our members in Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu and Samoa. Now, for quite some time, especially when we were tracking the commitments related to education for all in the earlier period, official statistics would paint a very rosy picture of adult literacy and performance with respect national performance in terms of adult literacy. But civil society organizations knew that this was really not the case. To a large extent, because obviously reporting on adult literacy statistics comes from self-declaration, right? So it's not a very reliable way of counting how many are actually have access to adult literacy and numeracy. So we worked with the Education Campaign Coalition in Papua New Guinea, Samoa, and Solomon Islands in first developing what could be a simple test that we could undertake at the village level, at community levels. It didn't have to be a national survey. But to get a sense of actually what is the proficiency for adult literacy and numeracy that was available. And so we worked with them. We designed the test with them. We worked with them in training the community researchers. And it did obviously reveal that the adult literacy competencies were actually much lower than what was conveyed in official statistics. And armed with this data, we worked with them in setting up meetings with the Ministry of Education in these countries so that this alternative data can somehow convince them to pay more attention to adult literacy. And so years down the line, the government, particularly in Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands, therefore decided that they should actually have a rethink of their adult literacy policy. Actually, it also helps if we are able to share information like this or data like this in regional spaces. Because in some instances, in many instances, it's a bit more restrictive to approach governments, for example, at the national level. There are other constraints, protocols, considerations, which prevent a more open access, if you like, to decision makers. So you can't easily go with data like this and get the hearing that you think you need or you deserve. But in regional spaces, for example, when UNESCO organizes technical workshops, say on adult literacy, and you come with data like this, first of all, UNESCO can listen to this, and they could then have the ear of national governments.
I understand that ASBE, you have told us a lot about what you've been doing, but in terms of achievements, I understand that you celebrated your Golden Jubilee in 2014. So what would you list as your major achievements? What would you say are the major achievements?
Well, I think surviving for 50 years is an achievement in itself. Sure. We are a fragile community, civil society. We're noisy, we're dynamic, and we, of course, can claim we're very effective, but we're fragile, right? There are a lot of things going against continued survival of civil society organizations. So the fact that we've been able to sustain ourselves at this point beyond 50 years is, well, an achievement on its own. Obviously, through the years, we believe that we've been able to train and mobilize hundreds and perhaps thousands of leaders in adult education who are rooted in the practice at the national level and therefore contribute to the promotion of adult education and in ensuring that quality adult education survives and thrives. We've had impacts as far as policy change is also concerned. We were able to, I think, in our view, shaping policy is that's a complex process, and you can probably look at how you're impacting on policy change in different ways. You can look at it in terms of shaping public opinion, no? So changing how publics view a certain issue. So through awareness raising campaigns and the like. It could be in terms of changing processes, no? For example, making sure that there's a seat around the table dedicated for civil society. It's a process change that's progressive. And that could then lead to actual policy change because you have direct access to decision-making processes. And of course, the change in policy itself. Obviously, it's for a regional body, it's not so easy to attribute directly our impacts in terms of some of the changes we have seen in adult education policy. But certainly, we think, opened a lot of doors in terms of institutionalizing civil society participation in a lot of regional and global. For example, we struggle to get even just a presence in conferences talking about the direction of education for all. But after sustained efforts by different groups, including AVASPE, there was in the Education for All process a dedicated space for civil society. Originally, it was oriented only for international NGOs, but because organizations from the so-called Global South, from Africa, from Latin America, the Arab region, and Asia, worked hard to establish ourselves as credible players as well, we earned seats to make sure that Southern voices were actually part of these processes. And these spaces carried on to the current SDG, or Sustainable Development Goal 4 processes. So we think this changes in terms of the way the policies are defined and civil society participation being entrenched in this would be a strong contribution of organizations such as ours, but obviously we don't claim to be the sole players who made these possible.
Yeah, but I think that given that in the global arena, the northern NGOs, the northern either international NGOs or other NGOs and networks have such a big say, have such a large presence in the international scene, in terms of policy making and so on.
Yeah.
The fact that you as a regional network were able to participate and make significant contribution to Agenda 30. The Sustainable Development Goals would be very important, I think.
We think so too. We think so too. And we actually use the space of our 50th anniversary to build a strong input and dynamic to influence this process. No, we could have just partied through 2014, which was our anniversary year. But we thought it was a very good moment, given the historical significance of that year to the organization, and therefore the space that provided for wide-scale consultations among our membership, to locate the discussions about ASBE's future, lessons from its past, and the direction we should take in the future, into as well getting the views, perspectives of our members in terms of what is the shape that the new education agenda post-2015 should be. So we were able to therefore construct a broad-based process of consultation. Therefore, our contributions in the global processes defining the new education agenda was rich, was robust, and well-grounded in the realities of our region.
Yeah, Ms. Khan, what would you see as some of the educational challenges in India and Asia today, Asia Pacific today, as the major ones?
Well, after the Education for All process, right, there was some people would say that education access was no longer an issue, that in fact we should be shifting our attention to education quality. Now, we think that actually there are two sides of the same coin. We think, and the problem still persists in terms of access. While there have been improvements in terms of participation in the formal system, especially in primary schools. Well, we haven't achieved the target of universal access to primary education by any measure. So they estimate now that if you also consider access to secondary education, because that's the current promise now in terms of the new agenda for education. The UNESCO Institute of Statistics estimates that there would be as many as 269 million children and young people who would be out of school. So access remains an outstanding issue. And obviously that children who have never been in the system and who are pushed out of the system, and with the limitations in the public education system to get them back, end up without access for many of them to literacy skills. So the figures as far as adult illiteracy as well have remained the same even after several international commitments to eradicate, as they call it, or to end adult illiteracy. So again, UNESCO quotes as many as 758 million adults without literacy skills, and they would be, of course, 2/3 of them would be women, and majority of them would be in South Asia. Now, the highest concentration of those denied literacy skills would be in our sub-region in South Asia. At one point, they said India. I think a 2014 report of UNESCO pointed to India specifically being a large population country as the country with the highest number of adults who are denied adult literacy access. So access remains an outstanding issue. But of course, we don't think just any education should be accessible to citizens. No, we believe quality education is what should be accessible, and there are issues related to quality. There are debates at the moment about, and we think this will persist, about what is quality education, how should this be expressed, and obviously we should look at quality education not only in terms of how it expresses in the formal system, but also in terms of non-formal education and non-formal adult education provisioning. But there's one trend which looks at education, quality education, largely through performance in tests. That's easier to measure. That's easier to track. There is also a whole economy around testing, which promotes why testing should be the great measure of quality. But there are alternative voices and equally strong voices about looking at quality in a far more holistic way, right? To make sure that the education that people receive are oriented towards their full human development, no? And where quality is therefore seen not only in terms of the performance in tests, but in terms of the content of education, in terms of how education fosters critical thinking, curiosity, an ability to relate with others, how to communicate well, how to work with other people, and the values of tolerance are engendered in people. It also, if these factors, if this is how quality should be viewed, then this has implications in terms of teaching, of the teaching profession, in terms of the content of curricula, in terms of learning materials and learning environments, which in that totality would therefore have to be considered when one speaks about quality, not only in terms of how people perform in tests. So we think quality remains an outstanding issue which needs to be addressed, and that applies to India as the rest of the Asia Pacific. We are very concerned about the continuing neglect of adult literacy and adult education in in education policy and financing. We are heartened that the new SDG agenda talks about the promotion of lifelong learning opportunities, which means there's definite opening and recognition that education policy and provisioning should go beyond the formal system, should not only be about children, should encompass the learning needs of youth and adults. But still, to a large extent, it's interpreted as education in the formal system. So lifelong learning is interpreted in many instances as only primary education to secondary education to tertiary education. Maybe early childhood care gets some hearing somehow. But all the other learning opportunities that are required, especially for those who have been pushed out of the system, still have very low priority. The latest assessment of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning in their last global report on adult learning and education indicate that national budgets only allocate less than 1% to adult education.
So thank you very much, Ms. Khan. It is a pleasure speaking with you. And what I would end with is saying that more power to you, to ASBE, to carry on the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to share our work with you.